Hey everybody, I'm Autumn. I'm the TA for this class, and I'm also a PhD student in the Religious Studies department, where I study late medieval and early modern women and ritual change in England. In particular, I study a specific set of childbirth rituals and their change during the Reformation. So I study the period between 1450 and 1700, roughly speaking. But I've also always been very interested in the ways that we think about the Reformation today, the ways that we represent it, and the ways that we talk about it. And so I was hoping to kind of meld these two things together in my lecture today, in which I'm going to talk about um, medieval Catholicism and magic. And I use the term magic colloquially because I don't really yet have a better term for it in terms of how we're discussing it in the context of this class. So we'll talk about magic and its place in Catholicism. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And here we are. I'm going to minimize me because you don't need that. Great. So today I want to, again, meld these two interests together and talk to you about women, magic, and religion during this time period. And also about how our perceptions and our discourse today reflect not really historical reality, but kind of the narratives given to us by the so-called winners of the Reformation. My hope is that you'll reflect on these stories and take a moment to examine why stories are told in certain ways and by whom they were created. And of course, I hope you learn a bit about late medieval and early modern religion, which will challenge some of the things that you might have learned in the past. I'm going to begin by examining some popular myths about religion and magic in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, again, about 1450 to 1700 in England, and then move on to an explanation of the ways in which magic was used within Catholicism, specifically within childbirth rituals, ending with a look at how the Reformation changed both those practices as well as views about gender. So, let's start with some popular myths about the Reformation, some of which you have probably heard before. So we have Catholicism was primitive and in need of change. This is perhaps the most widely cited reason today for the Reformation. The story goes that priests had become so greedy and religion so corrupt and superstitious that it needed to be reformed. Secondly, Catholics were superstitious and uneducated. Another popular assumption is that prior to the Reformation, people were basically uneducated. The church wanted them to be uneducated, and that somehow education was prohibited or in some way barriers were put up to it for poorer lay people. Women were oppressed by the church. This is both true and not true. We could go on for days and days about what oppression means in a historical concept or context, excuse me. But generally speaking, this refers to the stereotype that women were oppressed by the church by being forced into convents or accused of heresy and witchcraft when they were assertive. Another stereotype is that witch hunts were popular and frequent. This is a really, really traditional view of the Middle Ages, that there were frequent accusations, witch hunts, burnings. It was just burning, burning, burning all the time. And finally, that men, especially priests, wanted to persecute women who performed rituals. And this, again, is part of the story of the oppression of women and women's knowledge within the church. So these are things that we've kind of like run into in society and in popular culture and movies, novels, things like that. But I would love to give you some things to consider from a scholarly point of view as you begin to study magic in this time period. So going back to those stereotypes about Catholicism being primitive and needing reform, historians have actually found that Catholicism was pretty thriving, popular, and engaged up until the Reformation. And that, you know, there were plenty of controversies, different things going on, excuse me, but Catholicism had historically been able to deal with various strains of Catholicism kind of under a big umbrella. And, there was contention over points of doctrine, but it was easily still held within that unity. But what the Reformation was really about was not necessarily corruption in the church, but rather political considerations. So many European rulers were becoming more and more worried about the influence of church law on the laws of their nations. In particular, Henry VIII in England, who, by the way, did not break with Rome to marry Anne Boleyn. It's a bit more complicated. He found that the laws of the church began to conflict with what he considered purely domestic laws. So this was an argument over who had primacy in England, the king or the pope. So the break that happened with Rome was the culmination of literally centuries of arguments between England and Rome, and not the sudden result of the king's lust. Other European rulers found that having a national church or a reformed church made more sense as they began to participate in state building, which was a big project of the early modern period. So about education, it was not forbidden. It's true that education increased after the Reformation due to an emphasis on Bible reading, but it only actually increased for a very specific group of people, which were the upper class and middle class boys and men. In the Middle Ages, it was actually for a very long time not considered very manly to be very educated, sometimes to even know how to read. So learning in England really didn't have its heyday until the humanistic scholars, which was around the time of Henry VII and Henry VIII. But when the Reformation came around and people started, learning to read and read the Bible, women's education in a lot of countries at this time actually declined because of the loss of convents. And in terms of poor people, they didn't see much change at all. Many of them stayed largely uneducated. Education was never forbidden to anyone in medieval England. It was just simply something most people couldn't really afford because you would have to send your kids to a convent or a monastery. The state hadn't yet developed the bureaucratic methods needed to institute a big, large public education scheme. So this idea about the oppression of women, again, it's complicated. There were certainly areas where that's true, but English women were famously free compared to their continental counterparts. In Italy, for instance, women were all but sequestered to their homes. English women of this period were able to drink in taverns together in mixed company. Many religious festivals encouraged mixing of the sexes. Women often owned or ran businesses and traded in their own names. All of this began to change after the Reformation when motherhood and marriage were seen to be almost religious callings. But before this period, women were actually, they wouldn't be free in the sense we are today, but they had a lot more autonomy than is popularly portrayed. So about witch hunts, we associate witch hunts with the Middle Ages, but they actually clustered in the 17th century for the English. That would be around the 1600s, which is well into the early modern period. Witch hunts in England, furthermore, tended to happen in localized clusters and usually reflected tensions between traditionalists, so Catholics, and reformers, and often included accusations against men as well. So this wasn't necessarily women who spoke out or who had position in society or, whatnot. These were largely religious conflicts. In terms of men persecuting women, as we'll see, medieval Catholicism included many elements of magic, and women were considered the household ritual specialists. So they took care of the household shrines, they prayed for the household and its concerns, made offerings at local shrines, and priests were part of this culture in that they crafted many of the goods women would use in their rituals. We'll talk more about this later, but it just shows that there was more of a partnership and more of a cooperation between women who were doing most of the household rituals and priests who were providing the goods in the liturgy. So often what we think we know about a past event or series of events, such as the Reformation, it's really based on narratives created by the so-called winners. In this case, it would be the reformers or the Protestants. Even the word we use, Reformation, assumes that medieval religion was in need of change or was deficient in some way. Reformers viewed Catholicism as primitive and based in magical and superstitious thinking. So now that we've spent some time thinking about what we've learned about medieval Catholicism and women's roles in the past or in popular culture, let's take a look at what historians actually know about Catholic practice during this time, including the role of magic. I'll begin by introducing you to the many different kinds of ritual objects that were used, mainly by women during childbirth, since that is my specialty, and the communal nature of their use and their distribution. I'll then present to you my working hypothesis, which is that the ritual use of these relics and other goods allowed women to participate in a spiritual or a magical transference economy that was lost with the coming of the Reformation. Now on to the good stuff. Birth girdles. You're probably wondering what this is. So my fascination with women's ritual during this period began with an interest in birth girdles. I think it makes sense to at least bring you up to speed on what that means. So birth girdles weren't girdles in the modern sense of shapewear, but referred instead to what today we'd call a belt. The girdles were usually associated with the Virgin Mary, although there were many associated with other saints as well, and were sometimes borrowed from churches or monasteries, or as we'll soon see, created by individuals. Women in labor were meant to wear them around their waist or belly as a form of protection during labor. So this photo is the birth girdle said to have belonged to the Virgin Mary, excuse me, which is now held in the cathedral at Prato in Italy. It would have been loaned to local upper class women during labor. Though it was the uniqueness of birth girdles that brought me to this work, there actually exist many different kinds of ritual objects when it comes to childbirth in medieval England. Aside from girdles, women used paternoster beads, which basically are the forerunner of the modern rosary, circlets, necklaces, and even printed girdles. Printed girdles were manuscripts with written prayers that were meant to be worn around the waist like a girdle, sometimes with particular prayers positioned over the uterus. These were worn sometimes during pregnancy, but more often during labor. No matter the form, ritual objects show us that childbirth was an area of particular concern for medieval women, which warranted extra spiritual protection. As time went on and England became urbanized, ritual goods were also consumer goods and became a source of conspicuous consumption for some. Wealthier townswomen would sometimes buy flashy girdles from which to hang their paternoster beads, which you can see pictured here. And in the 16th century, print rose to demand by churning out a sufficient supply of prayer scrolls and printed girdles for those who could pay. So everything became a little bit more accessible at this point. Lapidaries are what that can refer to the books that describe what properties various stones have, magical properties, or it can refer to the stones themselves, excuse me. And here you can see a little picture of people buying the stones in the market. So Catherine French argues that bourgeois Londoners were particularly likely to copy the royal family's birth preparations as they assumed them to be the most efficacious. Obviously, God would favor the royal family as they were trying to birth an heir, and therefore whatever religious rituals where they were doing, other people wanted to copy. So that meant acquiring substantial ritual goods and a costly layout for the birthing chamber. Birth, therefore, can be seen as aspirational for at least this class, as they sought to use their wealth as a means to better petition for the safe delivery of an heir. I've put the citation for this article, by the way, at the end of these slides for anyone who wants to read more about kind of the trade and ritual goods and the economy, that aspect. Aside from being able to purchase certain goods from merchants, priests also manufactured amulets, prayer scrolls, etc., for the use of the laity. Contrary to popular assumptions today, the priest was not likely motivated by greed, or at least not solely. We can't assume that. Before the Reformation, priests often ministered in the same village in which they grew up, which means they grew up in the same religious context as everyone around them. They were inculcated with the same beliefs, the same ritual culture, as their neighbors. So producing ritual goods was simply a part of what they did. So how exactly did these goods work in the medieval mind? To explain this, I need to explain what relics are and how they work. Generally speaking, the locus of holy power was the body of a saint. That's the primary place of holy power. This is why the body parts of saints are so revered and why miraculously preserved bodies are evidence of sainthood. Body parts are known as primary relics. Objects that have come into contact with sacred bodies are themselves made sacred by that contact. Thus, these are what are known as contact relics. A contact relic can be any item that the saint either owned or touched, for instance, a cloak, walking staff, a ring, a girdle, etc. A tertiary relic is a relic that is made from touching an ordinary object, such as something you might get at the market, maybe you buy your own belt, and you touch it to either the contact relic or the tertiary relic. Or I'm sorry, the tertiary relic is a relic that's made from touching an ordinary object to the contact relic or the primary relic. See, even I get confused these days. So you see in the second photograph where the woman's touching a bunch of rosaries to the reliquary. The reliquary is the little fancy thing in which is, in this case, the finger bone of St. Anthony. The idea is that even when these ordinary items, these rosaries, make contact with the relic, they acquire some sort of sanctity. So to lay people, all relics, whether they're primary, contact, or tertiary, are simply known as relics. And I only differentiate here so that I can later on show it in the diagram how this will all work. But don't worry if you can't keep all of these in your head. So let's look at how this operated in medieval England. Only aristocratic women had access to primary or contact relics that were held in local monasteries. Therefore, lower class and peasant women had to make do with creating their own tertiary relics. This often meant taking their own girdles or beads to the side of the relic and touching them to the contact or primary relic. In this way, their ordinary girdle was made holy and could be used as a ritual item during labor, for instance. Women also left childbirth ritual goods to the church to be distributed to other women in the community as they needed them. One Westminster woman left a circlet to adorn the image of St. Margaret at her parish church. It was loaned out to brides on their wedding day, presumably as an aid to fertility, since St. Margaret was so associated with fertility and childbirth. That same statue of St. Margaret also had a coral necklace, another object associated with childbirth and fertility, and likely loaned to local women. Many medieval people had a much closer relationship to the saints than modern Catholics today. Unlike today, where saints are seen mostly as exemplars, medieval English people viewed the saints as helpers and actual members of their communities, like literal actual members of their communities. Cities, towns, and villages often had their own devotions to particular saints, who in turn played a vital part in their specific communities. Using a girdle or other ritual object associated with a saint was perhaps one way that laboring women could tap into the larger community of support. One of the most interesting observations I've had in my research is how much the creation, use, and passing on of ritual childbirth goods resembles the practice of divine economy. To give a very short explanation, medieval Catholic theology involved certain spiritualized economic principles that together are known as the divine economy. Part of the divine economy, or one of those principles really, is the idea of the treasury of merit, which is the idea that saints had led such holy lives that all the good they did in life added up to far more merit than they could use, and that the excess was stored up in heaven to be made available to those on earth who prayed to these saints, kind of like a bank giving out loans. This concept of the treasury of merit was part of a larger theological concept, that of the communion of saints, which comprised all living and dead Christians whose duty it was to contribute to everyone's welfare. So this is where we're going to see those different types of relics. Excuse me. So what occurred to me was how the creation of relics related to childbirth allowed for the exchange of holy power between members of the communion of saints, both living and dead, and specifically allowed women a very important role in the exchange. We see here a very simple diagram I made to explain the exchange of holy power from the treasury of merit to the relic and on to the user, and then back into the treasury. So you have the saint at the top, who of course, again, is the locus of holy power. You have a contact relic, or in some cases, even the bones of the saint. You make a tertiary relic out of that. The live participant is the person still alive who's using the relic in the ritual. And then they perform a thank offering later sometimes in the form of offering these things back to the church for other people's use, or just offering objects to statues, which is sort of a returning of that power. It's cyclical because the power itself is in constant flow, with a thank offering from the living woman, or by being passed on to other women by leaving tertiary relics at shrines, churches, and statues for the use of the community, or by being left in wills. The thank offering, whether in goods or prayers, was especially important as it was believed that one needed to honor the saints in order to induce them to intercede. Medieval sources abound with descriptions of disastrous reversals of fortune when someone neglected to leave a thank offering. Here's a picture of a statue of the Virgin Mary with with Jesus. And this is like a ton of thank offerings that have been left there. This is still a practice in many places. Back in the medieval era, these would have been like resplendent in color. They would have been shining with silver. One of the most popular things was to make little silver shoes for saint statues, to dress them in bright clothing. They were very revered, very much treated as part of the community. We know that the Reformation disrupted a lot of the theology and ideas underpinning the practices that I've mentioned. So for instance, the concept of the communion of saints changed to exclude the dead. That meant the loss of the treasury of merit, since the dead could no longer intercede. The practice of using birth girdles, beads, and other ritual objects eventually ceased. Those relics that were found by reformers during church visitations were burned or otherwise destroyed, and the people warned to give up the practice. William Shaxton, the very reforming Bishop of Salisbury, said in the 1530s that people should be dissuaded from using, quote, any girdles, purses, measures of Our Lady, or other such superstitious things to be occupied about the woman while she laboreth, to make her believe to have the better speed by it, unquote. So the Reformation had many consequences other than those that I mentioned. In terms of women's roles, they changed substantially. Women could no longer go into convents. Their highest calling was now considered marriage and motherhood. That meant that they were no longer necessarily participating in these childbirth rituals. They were no longer considered to have any religious role within their household other than that of wife and mother. And there were very circumscribed rules and rules of conduct for wives and mothers. So practice changed, eliminating beliefs such as the divine economy and the efficacy of saints. That means once the Protestants decided that we could no longer pray for the dead, then that meant that we could no longer implore the saints for help. And that obviously just takes everything out of those birth rituals right there. You can no longer ask the saints for help. Some people did change it to prayers to Jesus, things like that, but they changed substantially because having ritual objects was considered too Catholic. And so it just became regular prayers rather than a whole ritual. Priests were no longer local and didn't partake in didn't necessarily, I should say, partake in local religious culture. So the new Church of England would centrally train priests either at Cambridge or Oxford. And then those priests would be sent out to different parishes to live and work. So they were no longer part of the very particular local religious culture and may not have been aware of some of the traditional ways that things were done. Catholicism began to be associated with foreigners and also became linked with diabolism because of ritual elements. So as people, as generations went on and people became further removed from their Catholic ancestry, all the rituals began to seem very strange. And yet people on the continent were still doing this, especially in France and Spain, which were still very Catholic. So Catholicism became associated with foreigners. It became associated with being treasonous, because if you were Catholic and you listened to the Pope, well, that means that you put the Pope higher than the king. And so it took on this very political element. And also ritual had been suspect for a long time, and it became at this time linked with diabolism, Satanism, witchcraft, things like that. So I tried to pack a lot in here, but I hope that you got a sense of the ways in which medieval Catholicism actually worked and how its practice was later characterized by reformers, leading to our modern thinking about the magic of that period, and in particular, the ways that women used it. I'm always excited to talk about this topic with anyone, so please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if any of what I said made no sense whatsoever, or you just want to talk more about it. I hope you all have a great week and that you had a great holiday weekend. We'll see you next time.